Psalm 11 has as its central metaphor that of the throne, God's throne on earth in Jerusalem and God's throne in heaven. It's classified as a lament because generally it is a complaint against the conditions in society, and then a response of faith that reminds us that God is still on the throne. As a lament, we're going to take a look at the various elements. We see first the name Yahweh is the term that's used to address God in this case. The psalm begins with a statement of confidence and trust. In the Lord I take refuge. And then we have the complaint. Apparently there are those that are saying to David, you need to run, get out of here. Things are falling apart, escape. And so you can see the kinds of things that are happening in society. The wicked are shooting at the upright in heart, kind of surprising them, shooting out of the darkness. And the foundations of society are destroyed. Then we move immediately into confidence. The answer to that question is simply the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. And we get some resources for dealing with societal breakdown. There's a prayer in verse 6 for judgment. So this is an imprecation that comes following the acknowledgement that God is the judge. Then the psalm concludes with another statement of confidence. So you can see the psalm begins and ends with confidence and trust. And in the center of it is a statement of theology, that God is on the throne, that he is the just judge. Structurally, the psalm takes the form of a question and an answer. The first question is, how can you say to my soul, flee like a bird? So he is perhaps even saying this to himself. We don't know who the speaker is, but perhaps David is even having doubts himself and considering the idea of running, escaping, because things are falling apart. But the answer is clear, that the Lord is in his holy temple, God's still on the throne, God tests the righteous, and ultimately David is going to come out victorious. And so the structure of this suggests a chiasm, because we have the central idea stated in the center of the psalm in verse 4. Yahweh is on his throne, judging justly. Highlighting here some of the key words. Notice the references to the wicked and the references to the upright or the righteous. And these two are the primary conflict that's going on here. It's interesting that the actions of the wicked in verse 2 parallel the actions of God back in Psalm 7. You remember Psalm 7:11, God is angry every day. God is expressing his wrath. And God is described as the one who is picking up his bow ready to shoot and punish in his just anger. But in this psalm, it is the wicked who are unjustly shooting in the dark at the upright in heart. The central complaint is there in verse 3, what can the righteous do? You can see there's a footnote that gives an alternate translation there where the meaning is really unclear. I like the one that the ESV sticks with there, what can the righteous do? It seems that things are falling apart, foundations are destroyed, and so the complaint is it's over, and what can we do about it? The answer comes immediately in the following verse. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. Holy temple could be a reference to the temple of God on earth. Of course, in David's day, there wasn't a temple yet. It was a tent. It was a tabernacle. So that could be the reference here. So not only does God reign in heaven, surely, but he also reigns on earth. And that throne of God is the reference point for all people. Verse 6, this image of coals, fire, sulfur, can't help but be reminiscent of the judgment that came upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Anytime you see that in the Old Testament, that's probably the visible reference that they have for this. And of course, in David's day, you could go to this very area to the southeast of the Dead Sea, and you could see the remains of these cities. You could see the destruction that had taken place there at some point in the past. So this becomes a metaphor for the judgment that will come upon the wicked in general. Notice the same language that we find in Psalm 16 as well as in Psalm 23, only in this case, with those two psalms, they're both trust psalms, and it's stated that the Lord is the portion, the cup of the righteous. So the upright, the faithful, get God. That's their portion. The unjust, the wicked, receive judgment. So that's their portion. That's the cup that they will drink. Of course, elsewhere the psalmist will speak about the cup of God's wrath being poured out. Now, taking a look at the lens of the author, David wrote this most likely when he was fleeing from Absalom, when there was societal breakdown and chaos. This may have been the occasion for this. In any case, it doesn't seem to be a situation where there's a person identified. He's not speaking about a particular individual who's betrayed him or is trying to destroy him. Rather, it seems more general of societal breakdown and chaos. The psalm reminds us theologically that God is a refuge for his people, that God is sovereign. We go back to Psalm 2, where it states very clearly that God is enthroned in heaven, and he laughs at the futile attempts of man to resist that rule. Verse 5 reminds us that God has endowed us with free will, that he tests the righteous, that he allows things to happen within his will that will test us and give us an opportunity to demonstrate faith. Verse 7 reminds us that God is a righteous judge who loves righteous deeds, and that the upright will see his face. Now, that's interesting, that metaphor of seeing God's face, because we're told in the Old Testament that no one can see God and live. So perhaps this is more in the lines of what the psalmist had said earlier in Psalm 4, as he prayed, "Let the light of your face shine upon me," and the Levitical blessing that God's face would shine upon us. Looking at the lens of the editor, one thing we can observe is that, numerically speaking, Psalm 11 falls in the middle of this group of 5 laments, Psalms 9 through 13, which are largely about societal issues that are causing grief to the psalmist. And so we might then think, well, let's take a look at Psalm 5, which is the central psalm of the group of Psalms 3 through 7. And sure enough, there's similar language, as you can see there in those verses, that God doesn't delight in wickedness. He hates evildoers, and you see the same kind of thing in Psalm 11. He hates the wicked, the one who loves violence. Likewise, in Psalm 5, you see the psalmist saying, "I bow down towards your holy temple, I enter your house." And Psalm 11, verse 4, reminds us of the same thing, that the Lord is in his temple. His throne is in heaven. So these two psalms fall in at the center of a group of 5 laments, each of them having at their center this image of God's holy temple. So no doubt some symmetry there as the editor places these psalms in order. Verse 7 reminds us of the fact that in Jesus we see the face of God. The psalmist here probably wasn't talking about literally seeing God, of course, but he was just wanting to experience the light of God's face shining on him, the goodness of God in this situation. Of course, in Jesus we do quite literally see the face of God. If we'd been around when Jesus was on earth, we could literally look at the face of God. Of course, we see him today in his life, in his teachings, and in his love and victory for us on the cross and his resurrection. James 1 talks about the testing of our faith producing steadfastness. And so it's very easy to make that connection to verse 5, where it says the Lord tests the righteous. He sees what they do. And so one of the reasons that we experience difficulty and trial is to develop our faith. That's how it's done. It's done through the rough and tumble of life, through the disciplines of trials. And so we can take heart from this, that there's a purpose for the trials that we are going through. The reference to fire and sulfur in verse 6 is also picked up several times in the book of Revelation as a picture of judgment. So the wicked get the fire and sulfur of Sodom and Gomorrah, while the righteous get to see the face of God and be in his presence forever. Let's finally, personal application now. I want to draw attention to verse 3 because I think this psalm is very timely for today. We live at a time in Western civilization where the foundations of our society, of culture, are being destroyed. And I believe this goes back to 50, 60 years ago as the smallest unit of society and the most influential unit of society, that is the family. That's the smallest unit of culture. The family has relentlessly been under attack, in my opinion, for the last 60 years, beginning with the 60s and the advent of no-fault divorce. We began to see divorce rates skyrocket, and that led to increasing brokenness among children of divorce. And that was then accompanied by the sexual revolution also in the 60s that began to disconnect sex from marriage. And then with the advent of Roe versus Wade in 1973, the continuing disconnect of sex and children. In other words, now you can have sex without any consequence as it comes to having children. And so we saw sex, marriage, and children all divorced from one another as well. None of that helped to build the family. It continued to degrade the family structure and all the good that families bring to one another and to society as a whole. And from that, things have continued to disintegrate as the idea of marriage then was broadened to include any two people who want to be in a permanent or semi-permanent relationship. So in recent years, we've seen that marriage now expanded to include same-sex couples as well. And even in more recent years, we have seen even the very idea of gender being declared to be malleable or changeable, that your gender is not inherent to who you are, but it is something that is based on your feelings, and then we can adjust our bodies to line up with our feelings. And so all these things that would have been unthinkable 50 or 60 years ago, the breakup of the family, the advent of same-sex marriage, the dissolving of the concept of male and female, these have been foundational to human society from the very beginning, and we've seen those unravel in Western civilization in the last 50 years, and so that what was once unthinkable is now unquestionable. So there's no doubt in my mind that we are living in such a time that the psalmist here is speaking of, and I will say that the answer is the same. The Lord is still in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. There are consequences for actions. There is judgment, as verse 6 tells us. There's a portion, there's a cup that is coming when we disregard the laws of God and the laws of nature. The good news is, for the believer, that these are but trials, these are but tests, and God is calling us to be faithful in the time in which he has placed us. He's called us to be faithful to his word and to the moral law and his teachings. He's called us to be faithful to the gospel and continue to teach the good news of Jesus. And he's called us to be faithful to him, to remain united with him and his purpose and his mission in this world, so that ultimately we will behold his face.